Well, hey there, friends. So this lecture is all about this book, Greens from Grass, by Lisa Cliggett, who's at the University of Kentucky. And she, I think I mentioned, was on my dissertation committee. So that's not why I picked the book. I picked the book because one time about mm, uh, 5 or 6 years ago, I was at a conference and I overheard some people at a dinner that I went to talking about this excellent book that they were using with their undergraduates. And it was Lisa's book, which to my shame, I had never actually read. I had read, I was her student when she was writing this book. And yeah, it came out the year after I left the university there. So I was excited to get it and read it. And I agree that it's a great book to use to talk about a lot of concepts that we've already talked about and to begin conversations that we're going to talk about in weeks 3, 4, and 5 in this class. So here we are at the end of week 2. We have our longest reading, and what I really want you to focus on in this book is really chapters 1 through 5, and then next week, when we talk about witchcraft and religion, I'm going to actually go ahead and revisit this book in chapter 6 of this book, which talks more about um, sorcery and witchcraft. Is that what she calls it? Yeah. So, just to give you some grounding, and you probably already know this because, of course, you've read the book, is that Lisa was part of a research project that began. See, I'm already out of order. What the heck? That began in the 1950s. So her work represents a technique that we call longitudinal research, which is to say that the data that she's collecting is part of a set of data that stretches over a really long period of time. Basically, the this book gets set in motion, 50 years before Lisa steps foot in the field. She um, she's part of a team that includes Elizabeth Colson, who's English, and she's at Manchester University, and a guy called Ted Scudder, who is at the State University of New York in Binghamton, but formerly had been at Indiana University. And so when Lisa was a student at Indiana University, she expressed interest in this project or was recruited for the project. And so she was able to be part of this project. You can see that this book, the first volume, comes out in 1960, and it's based on data that was collected in the 50s. So what had happened was, as part of a development project, as part of a, well-meaning white people project, a hydroelectric dam was built in in the on the Gwembe Tonga River. That is my brother calling me, so I'm just going to call him back. It's called the Kariba Dam. And what happened was the dam was built, you can see it here, in order to create electricity. The way that the electricity works is that the water from that upper part there on the left side of your screen is kind of captured by the dam and held back by the dam, of course. And as that water rushes through the dam, it turns turbines and things like that, which generate electricity. And then the water is, um, used to create power. Now, the truth is, the people in the villages don't need that power. They don't probably have electricity in their homes. especially not in 1960, they didn't. So this power is being captured for big capital cities like Lusaka, which is the capital of Zambia. And we see a lot of these hydroelectric dams popping up around the world. You know, if you know anything about like American history, we have quite a few hydroelectric dams here in our country too. Many of those were built during the 1930s as part of the WPA, the Works Public Administration. That seems like the wrong words for that acronym, but it was an organization, a government organization that was set up to do these kinds of infrastructure projects. There's a lot of really great things that come from having a dam, a hydroelectric dam. You get electricity, and who wants to say electricity is a bad thing? You can keep food cold, you can keep medicines cold, you can have light into the evening, you can do a whole lot of productivity things that you couldn't do without electricity. But there's a cost to pay for electricity. And in this case, the cost is that when they built the dam, you see that water that's there on the left starts backing up. And as it backs up, it starts overflowing the banks of the river and it creates a lake. Well, one of the disadvantages of creating a lake where there previously was no lake is that a lot of people who live along the edges of the river find that their homes go underwater. So one of the reasons that this project happened is because anthropologists were part of a team who wanted to look at the social effects of the relocation of these people. The people are called the Tonga people. They live in the Gwembe River Valley. And so this is the Gwembe Tonga relocation. And it's the relocation happens in the 1950s. And then the task of this project that's been going back, now 60 years, 70 years, is to evaluate what are these social changes. And that's part of why Lisa's writing the book. She's got this huge data set. So you can see there the lake, and you can also see the dam there at the bottom. Well, actually, that's an international boundary. I don't see the dam on this map. Trust me, there's a dam there. The part of Africa that we're talking about now is has had a lot of colonial activity since, let's say, the 1930s. And Lisa says that her book tells how women and men in one region of rural Africa have become vulnerable to material insecurity in gendered ways. Okay, so let's stop there and kind of break that down. First of all, it's important to note that she's talking about rural Africa. We do have a lot of readings, especially in the 4th and 5th week, where we're talking about urban Africans. But here we're looking at rural Africa. We're continuing what we started last week, well, I guess earlier this week, when we were talking about rural West Africa. And she's also saying that one of the things that's happening is that people are becoming poor, but not in exactly the same ways. Men are becoming poor in a way, and women are becoming poor in a different way, and that the manner in which this process is happening is actually disrupting the social fabric. Another thing that Lisa talks about a lot in this book is the conflict between the generations. So that she's capturing in this book a lot of conflict between parents and children. And, this is a concern because one of the things that has always been important, as we've been talking about in a lot of rural African settings, is this idea of relational personhood, where the person that you are is created by the person that other people are. And when you have a social fabric where people are in conflict over their inability to perform their relationality because of poverty, because of scarcity, because of austerity, then you've got a whole set of crises and dilemmas that really threaten the well-being of the people. So she's saying, it's gendered ways, and now, so when there's a problem, people want to fix it. So she's saying that there are gendered strategies that people use to secure their well-being as they age. So men and women become poor in different ways, and men and women try to address that poverty in different ways. So that's really the main thing about her book. That's what she's up to. She says, living with scarcity forces everyone to develop survival strategies that make use of what they have at hand. In extreme circumstances, the only resources at people's disposal are the social support networks that allow those with less to get something from those who have a bit more. So I guess that's probably the other thing to keep in mind here is that we're not talking about very wealthy people running in here and like saving very poor people. We're talking about poor people helping people who are more or less poorer than they are. And I think, this is something that I've observed so many times in my life. It's often the case that the most generous people, the people who are most willing to step up to help someone, are actually the people who have, relatively speaking, fewer resources at their command. I don't know if that could just be my Marxism talking, but that has been my personal experience as a first generation scholar. That the place where I come from, where people don't have much, it's the people who have the least who tend to be the most generous. Just something to mull over. Another really important thing that we need to review before we jump right into Lisa's book is the idea of the mothers brothers systems. Now, we've already been talking a lot about West Africa, and I talked to you about household relationships, and I talked to you about polygynous families, and I talked to you about siblings and half siblings. And so far, we've been talking mostly about patrilineal societies. This part of Africa down here, can you see my cursor, is what's sometimes called the matrilineal belt. What we typically find in this part of Africa are matrilineal descent systems. And you can see that they're fairly rare, relative to patrilineal descent systems. And matrilineal descent systems are sometimes called mother's brother systems. Here's an unfortunate and awkward thing that sometimes, it's hard to talk about, especially, with my feminism. It's sometimes hard to talk about this because I want us to say that there are societies out there where women are in charge, or that where women make a lot of decisions. And in fact, of course, there potentially could be, but archaeologically and ethnographically, we don't find any examples of what we might reference as a matriarchy, a place where women are truly in charge of, like, a government system, a political system, an economic system. But we do find societies that are what we call matrifocal or matrilineal. And that is to say that your descent, the person who you are, the identity that you have, is reckoned not through your father's lineage, but through your mother's. So one way of thinking about this is, in a matrilineal system, children would be born with their mother's last name. In our system, usually babies are given the last name of the father. But in a matrilineal system, the identity of a child comes from his or her mother. And one of the things that's important about that is that everything that has to do with identity, everything that has to do with who you are relative to everyone else, is going to be determined not through your father's family, but through your mother's. So you can see how right away that's going to be a very different type of orientation to the world. But the reason that we call these mothers brothers systems is because in matrilineal lineages or matrilineal descent systems, it typically is still men who have the political authority and also the economic control of a region. So one of the things that Lisa talks about, at great length in chapter 3, I think, um, chapter 2 and also chapter 3, is that one of the big challenges for people in the contemporary time since Colson and Scudder started this project, one of the things that has been changing is that the land has been degrading. Now that's due in large part to environmental changes. It's just the case that our planet is getting hotter. This is particularly true in Africa, where areas that were formerly arid are becoming more arid. Those arid regions are expanding. And so you've got, basically climate refugees. You have people who can't live in the place where they lived before because the crops that they grew or the animals that they took care of can no longer live there. You have some parts of the world that are becoming increasingly wetter, like going underwater. I know that's happening in Oceania. So those of you who've taken the Oceania course probably are familiar with that concept of places that go underwater. But here, what we're talking about are places that are getting hotter and drier. It's a lot harder to grow food. And in the last, let's say 30, 40 years, the place where these people have been relocated after leaving their ancestral villages have become more difficult places to make a living. So that's one set of crises that's happening to the people. But another set of crises that's happening to the people is that the world outside of their cultural bubble is also encroaching. So you've got more and more people leaving the rural area to go to the urban areas to find work or to take waged employment. And the task of doing farming or the other kinds of agricultural activities that, maintain the household are falling to fewer and fewer people, and they're falling to different people than in previous generations. In other words, women are shouldering the burden of doing a lot more rural work, while men are doing a lot more of this employment wage-based labor, and we get a lot of that in chapter 2 and chapter 3. We hear more about the history of that. But the whole thing with the mother's brother system is that traditionally, historically, culturally, women are not able to own or hold land. Women have access to land rights through their brothers. So if you see a woman out there farming, it's because that farmland belongs to her lineage, the lineage that she was born into, that she shares with her brother, not her husband. Now, of course, that's really, really different from West Africa, where we've been talking before, where women's access to land and women's access to wealth comes through their husband. So marriage alliances and things of this nature are very important. And they're important in the matrilineal belt too, but they're important in different ways. So mothers, brothers systems are are different from the patrilineal systems that we've been talking about before, because the way that identity is determined has to do with relationality through your mother. And when we're talking about relationality through the mother, the word that we use in anthropology typically is the word clan. Clan, C-L-A-N. So we're not talking about like a lineage or a tribe. By the way, the word tribe is such a difficult word sometimes because it does have all these connotations about like primitivism or connotations that are racist. And the word tribe is very troubling if it's just used willy-nilly. The anthropological definition of the word tribe is a patrilineal descent group. So if you're talking about a patrilineal descent group, there is absolutely no problem with using the word tribe in the context of anthropology. But you can't use the word tribe to talk about the Gwembe Tonga people. They're not a tribe. They're made up of clans, a whole bunch of matrilineal descent groups, groups that are descended through the mother's lineage. And they are united through alliances that have to do with bride wealth and marriage. But strictly speaking, you can't use the term tribe to talk about these folks. So that's why, in general, if you don't know the pattern of descent, don't use the word tribe because you can get yourself into some trouble. Just as a point of reference here, there is a little clip online that talks a lot more about this. I don't know, it's like an 8-minute video. It's definitely, so it used to be back in the day, a long time ago, even before I was an undergrad, although I think I probably got the tail end of it. Anthropologists used to be really totally into doing like kinship and studying kin groups, and that it was super important in anthropology. And then it kind of fell out of vogue, and people don't talk about kinship quite as much anymore. But in a lot of African contexts, studying kinship is uh, really just like I tried to hammer this home in the previous lectures. You just can't understate how important it is to understand who a person's people are. Like, who are your people? Where do you come from? Because that's how people determine who they are, and also what kind of access they have to resources like land resources to do farming, or let's say forest resources to do gathering or to find certain wood or berries or um, like whatever sorts of things you can glean from a forest, what we might think of as the commons, uh, or water resources. These are central to a person's well-being. And I guess the point, if there is just one point to make, is that back a long time ago, people understood how they related to the land and how they related to each other. And increasingly, because of climate change and because of the incursions of these, colonial systems that have done things like build dams and relocate people and place people on not reservations so much, but you know, uh, zoning, zoning laws, like this group of people can be relocated to this place. Things have started to change. So she has some important questions in this book, and she says that what she's focusing on are the elderly, because she finds them to be the ones who are most affected by the social changes that are happening. There's an important point there that I want to come back to. Remember, what one of the things that she says is that the elderly are experiencing this material deprivation in different gendered ways. Old men and old women are having different experiences, and they're also using different strategies to address these experiences. So these are the questions that she raises. This is all from chapter 1. What obligations do different family members have to particular relatives? Well, that's going to be different if you're a matrilineal or a patrilineal society, isn't it? One thing that we get over and over and over and over through this book is that the Gwembe Tonga do not play when it comes to mommy. People honor and respect mothers. And it is very important that we pay attention to that, because mothers and grandmothers always have this kind of moral upper hand, because mothers and grandmothers always, hey, does this sound familiar? I come from a big Irish Catholic family, so it sounds a little familiar to me. Mothers always have this way to guilt trip people into helping them out, because mothers are this central bonding piece of the culture. Fathers are important, but think about how you would grow up in a matrilineal society. The resources that feed you are not resources that your father has necessarily contributed to your life, but resources that would come off of the land of your mother's brother, your uncle, your matrilineal uncle. No, he doesn't raise you. He's not your daddy, but he is a significant economic figure in your life. And it is to him that you owe allegiance. What if that starts to change? How confusing is that for people? What rights does an old person have over particular offspring and descendants? So let me ask you this. Is there a way that daughters and sons are responsible to parents in different ways? Frequently, it's daughters who care for the elderly, their parents. Yeah. I mean, often when people become old and can't care for themselves anymore, it's often daughters who take care of their parents. Well, that's in our system. What's interesting is that in a matrilineal system, remember again, it's the sons that are going to be sticking around. It's the daughters are marrying into uh, the daughters are marrying men who have parents, obviously, who come from different places than the marriage group. Sometimes I start thinking about all the people and I get confused in my head. But typically speaking, what ends up happening, at least traditionally again, is that it would be daughters-in-law that take care of old people. Not necessarily, it's still women, it's still gendered. Care work is almost always gendered. But a lot of times this task falls to daughters-in-law in matrilineal societies. When resources are scarce, which family members find themselves excluded from social support networks? So again, this is a question that she's going to answer, but spoiler, it's a lot of times it's people who have stayed home on the farm. It's the people who didn't move, kind of counterintuitively, who end up being the least able to care for themselves. So one of the things we know about like rural livelihoods is that people tend to be very self-sufficient, and you would think that those are the people who can really stay self-sufficient. But what ends up often happening is that they get left out of the sort of cash-based things that families have started changing over toward. I hope that makes sense, but it will make it's very abstract, but it'll make more sense as we work through it. And then finally, why do some people find themselves excluded and other people not being excluded? And this has everything to do with those strategies that she was talking about. And unfortunately, it ends up being the old men who get excluded the most. And this is so counterintuitive, because it's the old rural men who are really hurting in this new system. Now, in the next lecture, you're going to read a piece by Justin Willis that's about beer brewing in Zambia. Is it Zambia? No, Tanzania. So it's a similar kind of system. It's the Nyakusa people who are also a part of this matrilineal belt. And traditionally, historically, culturally, it's old men who called the shots. But because of the nature of social change in parts of rural Africa, especially in the matrilineal parts of Africa, old men are really in trouble. Um, in part because their gendered strategy is not one where they can be like, hey, I'm your mother, take care of me, or be deemed a horrible person. Men don't have that capacity in this part of the world. They can't guilt trip people into caring for them in the same way that women can. So this is chapter 3. And one of the things that she says she's really going to work on in this book, and I think this is really the strength of her book, is chapters 3 and 4. She's talking about the creation of gendered vulnerability in old age. That's another way of saying what we've already said before. And I've actually said a couple of these things already. There's a real difference in women's and men's resource base today as opposed to before. There's a real difference in the way that people interact, their styles of interaction, and that has a lot to do with whether you're a mother, a grandmother, a father, a grandfather. And there's also a whole set of coping strategies that people can use. And a lot of times those coping strategies have to do with tapping other members of the family network. And their ability to do that effectively means the difference between eating that day or not eating that day. So let me take you to, this is actually from chapter 1, the place where she talks about how she got the title for her book. She says, she's been walking, and she's been there in the village for about 3 months. This is the bottom of page 3. She says, her research assistant had told her that the owner of a field that was near her house had not been planted with corn, maize, in the previous year because the rains never came and the farmer didn't want to waste any seeds in a field that didn't have rain. So now on the field, wild grasses grew almost waist high. So not anything that's been cultivated, just wild grasses. And what she notices is that off in the center of the field, about 50 yards from the path, was an old woman, crooked with arthritis and years of hard agricultural labor, reaching her frail hands out to an individual stalk of grass. With one trembling hand, she grasped the stalk of the base of the 1-inch tasseled head. So little, right? With the other hand, she delicately harvested the grains on the tassel by sliding her fingers upward to the top and collecting the individual seeds in the palm of her hand. Hey, do you ever stop and like look at grass? Not like grass that people grow in their lawns, but like if you go out to the nature center or something, and do you ever look at like wild grasses? And at the top, they've got like little pods. One of the things, like think about like a sheaf of wheat. Wheat is a grass. One of the things that we do is we Americans, we people who've been doing agriculture for a long time, is we select through genetic, sort of selection, like we continually, generation after generation after generation, select the fattest, most robust, tastiest seeds. And then in the next generation, we plant those seeds. And over time, we create these domesticated crops. I'm sure you talk about this in archaeology. And so there are wild grasses that also have those little seeds at the top. Typically what we do is we take that and we process those seeds and then we grind them and we make them into things like flour, or we make them into things like rice, or we make them into things like milo or millet. Um, this is my brother calling me again. Speaking of relational personhood, we're trying to, uh, friends, there's been some family stuff with parents and elderly. So this book is hitting hard this week. Um, but what we see this woman doing is that she's getting this wild grass, and she's getting those seeds, and these are not big seeds. They're not big robust seeds. They're little tiny seeds, and she's collecting them, and she puts them into her chitange. That's that you see in that picture, that lovely purple wrap she has. It's, boy, you really can't find women um, in Africa who don't have like chitange, and it, man, they are so useful. You can use them for everything. And she poured the grains from her palm into the pocket of the cloth, and then retucked the ends back into her waistline. And then she reached for the next stalk of grass, about 2 inches from the one she had just harvested. I watched this process for a few minutes, during which time she harvested about 3 stalks of grass. As I watched, I asked Dravis, her research assistant, what she was doing. Despite seeing her action, I didn't understand the overall purpose. Dravis explained that she was collecting grains from grass because she had had no maize to eat that day. He told me that most people don't collect grass greens because the work is too difficult. He said only old women do that work. It would take her at least 3 hours to collect enough grass grains to make a small bowl of porridge that she would alone eat in one sitting. So we then find out that this is a very serious drought year, and food is scarce. In the old days, it's unthinkable that an old woman would go hungry in this culture that values motherhood and matrilineal identity. And yet, what Lisa witnesses is that in this time of crisis, here is this woman essentially fending for herself to fill her belly just a little bit, doing this very time consuming work that will yield very few calories. She's really struck by this moment, right? And it shapes a whole lot of the questions that she asks, which were back there on that slide before. So I should have shared that story I shared it out of order. I'm so sorry. My head's not really in the game today. Okay, so she says, this is on page 63. So now we're back in chapter 3. She says, part of grasping the range of elderly experience of vulnerability requires exploring how a matrilineal social system establishes who is family and who is not. We were just talking about that. The rules of property ownership and inheritance, and the notions of duties, rights, and responsibilities. So if you think about this is all that relational personhood stuff that we were talking about in the last lecture. You have to understand, in order to understand what's happening to the people, you have to understand their social organization, because it's their social organization that's going to dictate how they react and how they are resilient. Who's part of their network? Who can they tap? How do they get help? So this is really chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, but this is really the outline for chapter 4. So let's talk about this, and then we'll call it a day. Essentially, social organization takes place, if you can think about it, in kind of 2 little nested life experiences. One is the idea of farms. Farms have, in general, these resources: land, and the land is arable land that you can actually grow food on. Every community has places where they wouldn't bother trying to grow food because it's like, not good quality soil, or it floods, or they'd rather use the land to put in a road, or people traverse that area too much. You couldn't grow food there, or maybe there's like wildlife or reasons that you can't use that land. So there's good land and there's bad land. And remember, the land is owned, and I'm putting the word owned in quotes because if we want to be like super technical about it, nobody owns the land in the traditional system. It's the people who live on the land have the right to use the land if they belong to the social group. This is not something like they bought and sold, they don't have like a title to the land or whatever. And by the way, this is a big thing that colonialism does across Africa, is when the colonial powers come in. I mean, they like displace Africans right and left. It happened in this country too, didn't it? And then there were some governments that when independence was first declared, Zambia was one, but also Zimbabwe. At the time that independence is declared, the settlers are kicked off the land, like frequently through violence. And so, there's still hard feelings about that, like 50, 60 years later. But land and access to land is, it's political, it's economic, it's spiritual. And the opportunity, the right to work land is based on whether or not you belong to that land or not. Are you part of the kin group that claims the land? Well, then you get to work the land. The good land gets to go to the people in that system with the most prestige and status. Just like we've talked about before, you get different levels of prestige and status based on how long you live, based on your earned achievements, based on how many rites of passage you've done, whether or not you adhere to your obligations, or whether you like screw up and nobody thinks you're good. Did you do things well, like your rites of passage? Are people impressed with you? If they are, great, you're probably going to get access to good land. If not, well, you probably won't get access to as good land. The most important thing, though, is that women get access to land through their brothers, not their husbands, and that it's actually men who make these determinations. So that's one important factor here. The other thing that farms have in Zambia are animals, livestock. And so again, women take care of livestock, but women, technically speaking, don't own livestock. Now, I think this week you've watched the film Maasai Women. Oh, and by the way, I'm so sorry about that. I put that you were going to watch Asante Market Women, and we will probably still watch that film because it is truly excellent. But I just got my women movies confused, and so I loaded the wrong one, but it's fine. Well, it's all going to work out. But women don't, strictly speaking, own animals. They care for animals on behalf of their relations. Now here, this is one point that is really worth noting, and it's really important going forward into the future, is that land can be exchanged and trade hands. So a kin group has the rights of a piece of land, but they can trade out that land if someone compensates them for it. And the main way to compensate someone for land is through livestock. Another thing that's important about livestock is that it's also used as bride wealth payment. So remember what we talked about before: when a man marries a woman, he is responsible for paying her father, actually his lineage or his family or his household or his kin group is responsible for paying her father to compensate for the loss of her labor. That's called a bride wealth payment. And back in the day, those bride wealth payments used to go to men. They went to daddies. One of the things that Cliggott starts documenting in the later chapters of this book, and one of the things that we're going to talk about more in the weeks coming up, is that now, today, women actually, the bride herself can get her hands on part of that payment. And that changes everything, doesn't it? Because now you have women having wealth in a way that they formerly did not have access to wealth. But in general, when we're talking about these farms, we're talking about these spaces for self-provisioning. People are self-reliant on farms. And left, like if we didn't, you know, if we didn't have all this other stuff happening with social change, if climate change wasn't happening, if colonialism hadn't happened, if the global political economy wasn't like trying to get everybody to buy a Hyundai, farms would be the way to go. That would still be the thing. There's also villages, and of course villages are not part of colonialism. Villages existed before, but village systems are important in the way that she's trying to set up the social organization. One of the things that villages have is markets, so that if you don't have everything that you yourself personally need, you can get it. How do you get stuff? Well, you exchange currency for the stuff you want. So you need cash. There's a whole bunch of ways to get cash, isn't there? Well, there's income generating activities. And one of the things that Lisa says is that a lot of these income generating activities are things that women do. Women make baskets, they make pottery, they collect the big things of thatch that they can sell to people so that they can make fix roofs and make new roofs and build new houses. Women bake, and women also brew beer. Now, brewing beer is important. She has a lot to say about beer, but I'm going to leave beer for the next article because Willis talks exclusively about beer. Another thing that happens in villages is funerals are held there, but not just funerals, like all kinds of rituals, rites, any kind of like communal or ceremonial activity. That's happening when people who belong to a number of farms come together and someone has died and they mourn the loss of their friend. A lot of times they're drinking beer. There are probably other income generating activities associated with that. You need money to bury someone, basically. You need resources to pay homage to someone that you love at their death. The other thing I already mentioned is that men are frequently leaving, particularly young men. They're going to the cities, they're going to Lusaka, but they're also leaving the country. They're going to, I don't know, Dar es Salaam. They're going to Johannesburg. They're looking for employment. And when they get jobs, they then are making cash wages. So one of the things that's really fundamental here is that value is starting to change from like the land that you own or your access to that land because of your kin group to you yourself individually go away and start making all this money. And then, of course, it's your responsibility, if you want to maintain that relationality, to send some of that money home. Again, Cliggott talks a lot about that, but let's not talk super much about that until we're going to have a whole article about remittances and wage labor. And then the other thing that we learn is that because there's been this famine, there has been relief that's been introduced from the international community. In this case, it's the United Nations World Food Program has brought in some assistance for people so that they don't starve. But we also learn a lot about how you have to qualify for that assistance and how it's not a ton of assistance. So in general, what we're saying here is that village economies mean that people have to have some kind of currency. They have to have some kind of access to cash, and they have to be proficient with the use of that cash. So let's keep on going here. Are you with me? She says, in a crude breakdown of class in rural Zambia, women typically lack material resources, whereas men accumulate wealth through waged employment and property ownership. Now, this is back in the past. From this fundamentally different material base, older men and women then move through their daily lives and years with a clearly different repertoire of strategies for securing support from their relatives and their communities. In other words, older women's and men's spaces of vulnerability are vastly different and result in profoundly different relationships with other generations. You see that? You see how nicely she has just summarized all of this information from the previous slide? She's basically saying that in the past, because of this social organization, because of the way that things were organized, it was men who constantly were accumulating wealth and resources. And women always had access to those resources, but it was through men that they had that access. And now, in today's time, because of climate change, because of colonialism, because of an encroaching political economy that has a global focus, this dynamic, this set of social organization principles has transformed. And what it has done is that it has disproportionately affected women. Men are affected badly too, but it's women who have been more badly affected, which is why you have this old woman, this heartbreaking scene where she's like taking these pieces of grass and trying to feed herself. Okay, so that's part one of what's happening in chapters 3 and 4. Oh, shit, ran out of slides. Part two of what's happening in chapters 3 and 4 is that, and I think I've already mentioned this, the thing about the first part that she's trying to do, where she's trying to talk about how the poverty is experienced differently by women and men, is encapsulated here. Women are more badly affected by these changes than men have been. But when it comes to trying to find solutions, women have more advantages. And it is in part because of this way that women have that kind of guilt trip, that cultural guilt trip built in, so that women can say, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, now you help me. It's totally culturally appropriate for women to do that. For men, on the other hand, who have always kind of had this role as these gerontocratic leaders, remember gerontocracy means leadership by the elderly, they no longer have that. The men no longer have that. They cannot actually argue that they're worthy of like all this help. In fact, to ask for help would be totally humiliating. And so that's all, that's another big part of what she's saying really throughout. Oh, she talks about at one point early on, like there's an old woman, and the old woman is like, hey, help me, help me, help me. And everybody's like, oh, okay, grandma, let me get you some soup. And the old man is like, I'm not old. I mean, he's like, he's a leper. He lives all by himself. He's super poor, and he won't admit that he's old. So it's just, I mean, it's like, it's a little bit funny. And I know that we can all relate to some of this gender stereotype stuff. So I'm not gonna bang on this too hard, because you've got this Justin Willis article coming up, and a lot of the similar things, particularly the second part that's about strategies for resilience and how those are different between women and men. That's going to be really nicely articulated in the Willis article. There's one other thing that happens, and that's that chapter 6 that's about supernatural and sorcery and witchcraft. The other problem is that for the Gwembe it's not at all uncommon that people would believe that like spirit energy ancestors would like accumulate around women. That doesn't freak anyone out. Like everybody's just like, yeah, women are witchy and spirits love women. Nobody's freaked out. Nobody's super freaked out by women having spirits around them, even bad spirits. one of the things that's special about women is that they can plead with the spirits. They can be like, please leave my nephew alone. Let my nephew study. Let him go back to school. You know, like women have this kind of like witchy energy that nobody's that freaked out by. Men, on the other hand, are frequently thought to have, like if they're tripping around with the supernatural, it's thought that they're malevolent or that they're sorcerers or that they're bad, that they have bad spirit energy on purpose, and that they're kind of, you know, evil. So that's a worry for men, older men. So I'm hoping that you're enjoying the book. I think it's really an excellent book. I'm gonna revisit chapter 6 when I talk next week about the sorcery stuff. I am running a little bit behind on getting these lectures. I'm like just barely staying ahead of the curve. I've got a couple of them preloaded. I've got a never rains, it pours, right? There's like all sorts of things happening this summer that were not planned. And they have to do with my personal relationality. Um, so um, I appreciate your grace. Um, I hope that you have a really lovely weekend. I did post a thing about Juneteenth. If you don't know what Juneteenth is, inform yourself, look it up, figure it out, and we can talk more about Juneteenth next week. There is a celebration on campus on Friday the 18th at 1:30. And then there's also going to be on Saturday the 19th, there's going to be some kind of celebration at Silver Spring Park over in North Springfield. So if you're able to attend either of those things, hit me up, say hey, and I will make sure it's reflected in your grade. How about that for an incentive? I hope you're doing good. Take care of you, okay? Make sure you're getting plenty of sleep, eat right, be grateful for your blessings. Talk to you soon. Bye.